Hi, I'm Adam Pacifico, and welcome to The Leadership Enigma, a world-ranked, award-winning podcast that's insatiably curious as regards what leaders do, how they do it, and importantly, why. We'll delve into the human doing, but even deeper into the human being and the power of human-centered leadership to drive sustainable change. So whether you're an entrepreneur, business owner, corporate executive, each week we speak to global experts, academics, rising stars, ambitious upstarts and disruptors, as together we will discover that success leaves clues.
I'm delighted to be able to hand over to our star of the evening, our Olivier Award-winning playwright, Mark Rosenblatt. And he is going to be in conversation with Adam Pacifico. I'm going to hand you over to these two young men, and I'm sure you're going to have a very, very interesting evening. So thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thoroughly lovely to be introduced as a young man. That's something I'll enjoy. It's a huge welcome to all of you. My name's Adam Pacifico. I'm the host of The Leadership Enigma. We're a globally ranked podcast listened to in over 97 countries now, award-winning, not quite at this level. And it was a real honor to get a phone call from Jennifer, who indeed was a great guest who came into the studio in North London, and she rang me up and she said, "We're doing the 20th anniversary, would you?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "I haven't given you the question yet." I said, "Yes." And so it's an absolute delight to support the Heart Cells Foundation. And I think when we watch a video such as this, we really clearly understand why we're here, and what a delight that we have two people as well in the audience who are beneficiaries of it. So it is really just on me now to introduce the star of the show, which is indeed Mark. And it is very, very timely that we are having this conversation. Now, you'll notice there are cameras here because we're recording this, and this will go out as a podcast for the Leadership Enigma, and it will be one of over 220 episodes. So recorded, we're not going out live, but it is recorded. The cameras aren't facing you, they're on us. And also, I'm going to hand this conversation over to you, so I hope that you have an opportunity to ask Mark some questions. That is not part of the episode. That really is, I hope, part of the wonderful evening and the intimacy of this room. And David, thank you so much as well for offering this particular venue. It is rather wonderful, and I have made sure I have stayed away from the walls with the rather beautiful art that adorns them. So with that in mind, I'm going to really now get into the conversation with Mark. And Mark, you've been introduced now as the Olivier Award-winning Mark Rosenblatt 3 times. This can't quite feel real yet, can it? Tell us a little bit, how does that actually feel?
It feels new. It was Sunday night, so I mean, I could well have been here as, you know, the Olivier nominated, and that would have been great. But it is really strange and wonderful and surreal to hear that, that description.
When we chatted 2 weeks ago, you were the Olivier
Award
nominated.
Yeah.
We talked about that. But now, let's just also help people. It wasn't just one Olivier that Giant has won. It's actually 3. So as you may know, it was also Best Actor.
Yeah.
And John Lithgow was that indeed Best Actor. And also Best Actor in a Supporting Role. Elliot Levy, correct?
Correct.
So it's not 1, it's 3, Mark. Now how does it feel?
Feels 3 times as surreal. No, I didn't obviously win those. So, but it definitely, when you're in those situations, I think it's one thing for a show to win once, but there's a sort of triple enforcement of, you know, the voters getting behind the show that is very touching. And John Lithgow won. And Elliot both won their awards, their Oliviers, before me. And by the time John had won his, I said to my wife, you know, like, we're ahead, we're out. And there's something about actors winning for a play you've written that speaks highly of the play. Yes. So I felt like if that's all we do, when I say all, it was already amazing, and I didn't win anything, then we were good. But then it happened. So I was,
So this was a casino. You'd have kind of cashed out at that point.
I like to think so, but I might have been drawn in for another go. Yeah, no, I think so. It was amazing.
So what did it feel like as you went up on stage, received the award, and looked out onto your peers, and perhaps many people that you had looked up to, you know, over the years. How did that moment feel?
I mean, it's all happening so quickly. I mean, the weird thing is, of course, that you're getting, I mean, in my case, I was given the award by Ewan McGregor and Elizabeth Debicki, who plays Princess Diana.
It's not bad going, is it, really?
So that's already weird and surreal. And it's a huge stage, and you've got to, and also I'd been sat quite far back, so that was another reason why I thought I wasn't going to win. And I had a joke about the fact that I'd been sat quite far back, which I didn't use, and I used another joke, kindly gifted to me by someone else who'd already been up and made a very strange,
So we're
brilliant...
finding out how things work now, aren't we? Right.
No, I ditched it for a better joke. But yeah, so it was strange. But I don't know, we were told we only had 40 seconds to speak, and the first thing I was thinking was, I got to get through all these thanks. I got to say the things I want to say, and I felt weirdly calm. I don't mean that in an arrogant way at all. I guess you just go into you go into. I was nervous, but I was more calm than I was nervous, and I was, yeah, I was. There's no great answer to this question, because I don't have a kind of great eureka moment to share. It was really nice.
I don't think you can get any better than that, really, can you? Just really nice. Let me talk about another really nice moment, and let's go back to university days. And there's always that really nice moment for all of us where we're thinking, what shall one do with one's life?
Yeah.
Did you always know this was going to be your direction of travel, or how did you start to make your way into
Well, I mean, the first thing to say is I didn't know that theatre, I guess, and directing, because that's what I've been doing. This is the first play I've ever written, and I've never tried to write a play before, and I truly never thought it was in my wheelhouse to write a play. So I've worked professionally as a director since leaving university, and I acted at school, I acted at university, but I was primarily directing, and that's what I thought I was. And yeah, that happened as a kid. I loved theatre, I loved going to the theatre, and I wanted to do it, and I knew that from quite young.
Did you love writing?
When I wrote?
Yeah, well, years ago, even though you were directing, did you still have a love for writing? Did you find yourself writing?
No.
So where did that suddenly
Don't know.
pop up? I always love it.
I mean, I've a slightly disingenuous answer in that I had written for film a little bit, but the film that I'd written was adaptations of existing stories and plays. I'd adapted a few things for film. I'd never had the confidence to imagine myself writing originally. And when I went to the theatre and I watched, as we all do, go and see, particularly not classic plays, but new plays, the idea of being the kind of person who could hold an audience for 2 hours with story and themes and jokes and sustain, because, you know, a lot of people, I mean, film is a different discipline, and you have a lot else that can sustain the interest of a viewer, and there's other skills that come in, but largely with theatre, theatre is almost like one wide shot that has to sustain an audience for 2 hours. There's no close-ups, there's no cutting in, there's no cutting away often. It's just, and to write for that is incredibly hard work, incredibly challenging. And I really just never thought it was my thing. What I did do was work with and kind of serve writers. So I would help writers improve a play if it was a new play that I was working on with them, or I would take a view on like old plays where the writer was, you know, probably thankfully for them and dead. You know, work out where something felt it needed pruning or shifting or changing. But so that was a skill that I was always quite muscled up on. But that was what I thought my job was. So I really don't know how to answer the question about. It really is stunningly strange to me that I'm sat here being introduced as an Olivier Award-winning playwright, because it's not what I ever set out to do. And until I started working on the play, which was a while ago, like a few years ago.
Come on to that.
And even then was a sort of intrepid sort of adventure into the complete unknown for me. I wouldn't have put myself down for it.
When you and I spoke a couple of weeks ago, you said to me that there was a real nuance to writing for theatre, and I think you've explained that. I'm keen to try and identify at what point did it become viable in your mind that you were going to start writing for theatre? I know I might be turning this into therapy.
No. I mean, there's no. I mean, it really is this play. I mean, there's no other evidence.
It's not a bad first round, is it? You know.
No. I tell you. The one. I think I go back to the point I made before, which is just confidence. And I think a lot of people think there are things they can't do, and sometimes they're right. I think, but there are occasionally some times where you just realise that you discover you can do something.
Yes.
I probably had lurking under the surface of even my conscious mind a sense that I wanted to do more than direct. And I did always want to work in film, and I always had a sense I could write for film. But the first time that I wrote anything original was quite scary. It was a short film that I made in 2018-ish, and I wrote a story that was original, and wasn't based on anything. Some family stories, and that gave me a confidence because it went on the film festival circuit and people saw it, and I got good feedback, and I suddenly thought, it was a 14-minute film. But I thought, I could sort of imagine doing a bit more of this. And I really wanted to try and write a feature film. It wasn't until, but theatre, as I said before, is a totally different challenge. The only reason I went to do this is that the person who directed Giant, the play I've written, is Nicholas Heitner,
yes.
And he used to run the National Theatre, and I worked for him in a completely different role for a couple of years at the National Theatre when he ran it. And in 2018, I apologise if anyone's heard this story before, but in 2018, I had the idea for the play, and I was looking, as often directors do, for a playwright to write it.
Yes.
Really not thinking that was me. And I took it to Nick, who runs the Bridge Theatre opposite Tower Bridge. And as a producer, I took it to him and said, is there a way in which you might help me find a writer, and maybe we could develop it at your theatre if you like the idea? He really liked the idea. He listened to me talk about it. He said I was quite persuasive, and he suggested, in a moment that changed my life, that I might have a go at writing it, which I thought was ridiculous. He had no reason to suggest that based on it. There was no evidence for that other than an intuition of his.
Well, I said there must have been something for him, was giving him the signal that actually...
I thought he was fobbing me off, to be honest. But because there was no evidence...
It proves it wasn't really.
Well, he may have been, it may have been a lucky swing. But my agent, I told my agent that this had happened, and she said, Nick is very intentional in what he says. He doesn't sort of mess around. And if he likes an idea, he likes an idea. If he doesn't, he'll tell you. So
that's high praise from someone who knows a lot about this particular arena. But I'm keen to go back to something you said is you had the idea for.
Yeah.
Where did that come from? How did that start?
I was very conscious at the time, 2018-ish, about... First of all, I never set out to write a play about Roald Dahl, which is what Giant is about. But I'd always loved his writing. I'd always read him voraciously. As a child, I probably they were a bit young then, but I still read his books to my children now.
Many of us have perhaps grown up on Roald Dahl.
He's hard-baked into a certain generation's imagination. I listened to Timothy West and Prunella Scales' audiobooks of Dirty Beasts and Revolting Rhymes, as I went to sleep every night when I was a kid. I was also separately, and what started me thinking on this track was I was very aware of a lot of blurring that was going on in political discourse between sort of racism really and prejudice and meaningful political debate. Particularly as a British Jew, I was conscious at the time of what was coming out of the inquiry into antisemitism in the Labour Party, where you were seeing on many levels of the party evidence of this same thing, of the discussion, meaningful discussion about the very complex conversations around Israel and Palestine being blurred with hate speak and medieval stereotypes. And I just thought, is there a way of dramatizing this? And I remembered that, of course, Mr. Dahl had been accused of anti-Semitism in his life, but I couldn't remember what the context was. And I looked it up. I mean, it's on his Wikipedia page. And I read the offending article. It was a review of a book about the siege of Beirut in 1982 by the Israeli army during the Lebanon War.
Yep.
And it was written by a journalist who had been embedded, an Australian journalist who'd been embedded in Beirut during this devastating siege. And he and a photographer had published a coruscating attack on the Israeli army from the experience of living inside that siege, with photographs of, well, you can imagine, carnage, casualties, terrible injury and casualties of children. It was a really shocking document. Dahl was asked to review that book. He didn't normally review books. He rejected the offer initially and then eventually agreed. And it released an enormous sort of cascade of anger in him. And the article that he was vilified for at the time was that book review. It is a classic case of the thing I was interested in, the blurring of anti-Semitism and meaningful observations and criticism of what that Israeli administration and that army had done at that particular time. And he was called to account in a small way by the British press. There was a back and forth about it, and he was slightly scandalized at the time. And I thought, that's interesting. That's a good premise. That's a good dramatic setup. What was it like in his house that summer when the articles were coming in? What's important to say, and I don't want to give away too much about the play, but it's a matter of public record, was that he not only wrote the review, but he then went on to say the things that I think, if you know about what he said, that he went on to make in the press some extremely outrageously anti-Semitic, cruel comments about, that lean into a particular anti-Semitic slur, which is that the Jews are cowards. If I had been in line in the queue for the gas chambers, I'd at least have put up a fight. Those sorts of comments. Hitler was a bit of a stinker, but there's no smoke without fire. Those comments were made subsequent to the review, and it caused a furore. So I just thought, what was going on? The man who his imagination has enraptured me and enraptured so many people that could see the world from a child's point of view, who has such an influence culturally, also contained in him this, not just anti-Semitic views, other noxious views, but what was driving him, what happened that. And I just started to think about it as an idea for a play for someone else to write.
Let me just pause you there, because this is a fascinating subject matter area, because we're living in a world at the moment that is heavily polarized, and some of those divisions are deepening as well. And we see that in many, many regions. But I want to focus on something, because you're talking about curiosity over what might be perceived as a cancel culture. When something is said that a group doesn't disagree with, sometimes there's a cancel that person. But I hear from you, actually, you became deeply curious about, and there was a phrase that I saw, and we chatted about this earlier, where it was being alive to the hatred and the gift. So tell me a little bit about where this curiosity is coming from you. As you say, a British Jew who's now looking curiously at an individual who is saying some things, as you say, which on the public record, which are abhorrent. Where's this curiosity coming from to delve deeper and try and understand the colour of the character, both good or bad?
Well, I mean, maybe it's slightly dodging the question to say that probably I know what bores me in the theatre.
Yep.
And what bores me, or in any storytelling, is deciding that someone's a villain and then just telling the audience again and again and again that they're awful.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes for me that's interesting for 10 minutes. And I knew that if this writer and then me was going to do it, it had to offer more. It had to make it more ambiguous, more complicated. Also, I don't think, in the main, people are one thing, and certainly Dahl can't have been one thing because he had an innate insight into. It wasn't like he was hermetically sealed off from people and from empathy, because he was deeply empathetic.
Yes.
So what is the exception that his mind is making when it comes to the Jews, as he would sort of, throw them all together? I also thought it was, So I think that was the main thing, was it needed to sustain over a couple of hours and also it wasn't just about Dahl. It had to be complex from the other characters. They couldn't all just be right and him be wrong. There had to be, and there are things that he says mixed into the hate that have a validity. So it was about being alive to that too.
So, number of things that I'm hearing: curiosity, actually an empathy as well, an empathy to trying to understand the individual. But let me come back to obviously what Sir Nicholas Heitner said to you. Love the idea, why don't you write it? And then when we were chatting a couple of weeks ago, you said to me, there was an element of imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
You thought to yourself, hang on, can I do this? How did you deal with that? And how did you take that leap to say, okay, I'll write this, I'll take this on?
Well, I think it was just Nick is Nick. I mean, I wouldn't, there were very few people in the world that would have said that to me and triggered me going off for 3.5 years and working.
You need a good mentor.
Yeah, it was knowing that he was interested in getting a play. If I could write it,
yes,
he would read it. He's such a magical figure in a way in the industry, because he's made so many things happen, and is a producer. And so it felt like, and as I said, my agent said he's not messing around. So I thought, okay, he's endorsed the idea, he's going to read it. He's suggesting I write it, and then also lockdown came, and there was nothing else to do. So it really cleared the desk and gave me focus in a way that maybe circumstantially I wouldn't have had.
Well, do you think lockdown gave you an opportunity that ordinarily you may not have had, of that space just to think?
Yeah, definitely, exactly, yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the journey then through lockdown and how this started to form in your own mind and then start to form on paper. Did it flow? Did it
No.
stages?
No,
Did
it
you have
took
to go
ages.
backwards and forwards? Tell us a little bit of that process.
The confidence didn't suddenly seep into my veins. I did a lot of research, a lot of research, read an enormous amount, as much as I could, from the public domain about Roald Dahl. There are some brilliant biographies, there's some less brilliant biographies. They're all really useful. I tried to form like a kind of, I ended up with like a 60-page document, which was a timeline of their lives from about 30 years leading into the moment of the play in the summer of 1983, so that I could sort of know them as much as I could. I would watch him talking on YouTube, lots of clips of him talking on YouTube, so I could get a sense of his voice before I wrote in the morning. I interviewed a number of people that knew him and knew. It's also the players, I should say, for people that don't know, I'm sorry, I'm assuming that people do know. It's simply 2 hours at Roald Dahl's house in Great Missenden on a summer's day, when his two publishers, both Jewish, one American from his American publishers, and one British, his actual publisher, Tom Maschler, who ran Jonathan Cape, who was one of the great sort of wunderkind publishers of the time, and a man who himself created the Booker Prize, a huge figure in publishing, come to his house. I've imagined this. Come to his house to try to persuade him, slightly in cahoots with his about-to-be second wife, Lissy, to apologise, just to issue an apology for the things that he said in this very offensive article, and to persuade him that what he said isn't in any way offensive. And it's them working him and him pushing back. And that is the 2 hours of the show. And hopefully we sort of get deeper and deeper into other things that are going on. The house is a building site because Lissy, his about to be second wife, she's still alive, she's real. She was a formidable, brilliant interior decorator. And she just moved into the family home and taken over. Dahl, as you might know, was married to Patricia Neal, the movie star, the Oscar-winning movie star, and they literally just divorced. And Lissy, his second wife, with whom he'd been having an affair for 11 years, finally gets to move in. And so there's lots of sort of domestic politics happening in and around this conversation about Israel, Palestine, publishing, and Dahl is about to publish The Witches, and he's literally proofing it in the room as the play begins. Mm-hmm. So the question is, do you want your sales impacted by the things you've said? And they try to pull him this way and that, and it's about this irascible, curmudgeonly, angry, clever, agile man avoiding everything all the time, pushing back, making things very difficult, particularly for the American publisher who I've invented. So that's sort of the setup. And I met people who worked in publishing at the time and now, people that knew Tom Maschler, people that, some people that, I met the journalist who eventually interviewed Dahl, to whom Dahl gave these very anti-Semitic interviews. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I just sort of started to cook all these elements, stir them in the pot and tried to write it. And it took a long time because, as I said, I'd never written a play before and I didn't know if I could do it.
As you go on to explain it as you've done, there's a huge series of complexities there. We can hear it in relation to storyline, fact, fiction, the research. And then you trying to understand, as you talked about, the nuance of writing for the theatre. How do you captivate hundreds of people in 2 hours? How are you processing that in your mind and think to yourself, how will this, no pun intended, play out? How will this go down with a live audience? Because there's so much there.
I know. Well, I think
how are you processing that? I've turned it into therapy. I know.
No, it's not therapy. No, I mean, it's hard to reflect on it. I mean, it took a lot of it was an iterative process and a lot of like losing of faith.
Yep.
But I think the main thing is, I hope, and it seems to be the case, that it's quite funny. And I think the humour of the play, that these very witty and people who are using their wit to deflect from a lot of anger with each other in a recognisable social situation where they're having lunch together. And the fact that Dahl himself is such an outrageous character. I mean, he's a curmudgeon. He's in terrible pain. He's had 6 laminectomies in his spine over the years, and can barely move. The interior, the redecoration of the house has led to his bedroom having to be on the ground floor. He can't climb the stairs. There's building works going on. So he's in a real Victor Meldrew sort of moment.
Yeah.
And that in itself is funny. And so it's about allowing the audience to feel the sort of domestic humour of this situation before it becomes more serious. And I knew jokes would be a big part of sustaining it, because what it's really about is pretty dark and became very dangerous, because once the show was programmed, mm-hmm. the show was programmed on October the 5th, 2023, wow. And so 2 days later, the world, Hamas attacked Israel, and it was enormously concerning to us as we put the play in front of audiences for the first time the following year, that people would find it too raw.
Things get conflicted.
Yeah, but I think the fact that it was human and funny and rooted, and it really helped that.
With all of the work that you've done and now where you are today, have you come to a conclusion about Roald Dahl yourself?
I mean, he was no, I mean, I don't know what that. I don't quite understand the question because what kind of conclusion?
I don't know whether you've come to some form of insight after the research you've done, because we talked earlier about, and I didn't know this, he had also gone through some unimaginable tragedies himself.
Yeah.
So he'd had a painful life. So really, maybe the better word is, what further insight have you landed on now through?
Well, as you said, I mean, so his personal tragedies in his life, two of which were around his own children. His son Theo was struck by a car in his pram in New York when he was about 5, and suffered terrible brain injury. And his daughter died overnight from encephalitis when she was 7.
Yes.
And Dahl's sense of grief was, understandably, was Victorian. I think that I think what relates to that, and I do think is a big part of his pathology, is that he did an extraordinary thing when his son Theo was injured. Mm-hmm. He noticed that the valve that was draining the liquid of his son's brain, between the skull and the brain, was not a very efficient device. It was leaking, and it wasn't as effective as it could be. So, of course, what he did was, and this was absolutely what he was like as a person, he invented a new one, and he patented it, and it became the market valve for the next 10, 15 years. Right. He found an inventor and he found a neurologist, and they invented a new one. The patent didn't come through in time to treat Theo, who actually had a very good life since, but that was the man he was. He wanted to fix things. When his daughter died, he couldn't fix it. In fact, the terrible irony is that there was an outbreak of measles. The government, the availability of hemoglobins was limited, and only Theo, the older boy now, right, was allowed to have it because of his brain injury. They tried to get more hemoglobin for his daughters, and they couldn't get them, and she came home and died overnight from it. And he never, I think, couldn't forgive himself for not being able to, of course, protect his daughters, but also fix it. I think that he looked at the situation in Israel, in Palestine, as he had been an RAF pilot and flown out of Palestine before the war. I think he looked at that situation with through the same lens. I want to fix this. I want to write something that is so angry at what is happening, the death of children. I want to fix this. I want to stop this happening. And the only way that you can, unfortunately, the Israel-Palestine situation is not a valve. It's a deeply complex and nuanced problem to unravel, as we all know, and to understand and dissect. And I think he had to impose something very simple on it, which was to characterize the oppressors in a very narrow, crude way, and resort to antisemitism to do that. He was trying in some strange way to fix the problem by throwing stereotypes at it. Not, as it obviously dissimilar to the kind of mindset that other people of his generation had. Repped and educated, public school boy, 1920s, trained to run the empire, trained to go out to all sorts of countries and stereotype people, and to run those countries in the empire. So, very narrow views of people. So I think there's that. I think well,
that's a whole series of insights, right there.
Sorry to go on.
It's not, but the reason I mentioned that as well is because it is hugely complex, and we've talked about that. And you have been delving deep into that interface between the hatred and the gift. And I think there's a real strength there, especially as I talk about the polarized world we're in right now, is to try and understand with empathy and with curiosity why people think the way that they do. So with such a complex character, why John Lithgow? How did that come about?
Nick Heitner, when I finally did deliver the play to him at the end of 2022, he said to me, I've read the play, and I was like, yeah. And he said,
Bracing for impact.
yeah, I was. It had been 3 years of work, and I had no idea. And he said, I read it, and I really like it, and I wonder if you might consider me directing it. I was, yes, carry on. And then he said, and in the same phone call, who have you thought about for Roald Dahl? And I had a couple of names, but certainly not the one that he was about to say, which was John Lithgow. Yes. He said, have you thought about John Lithgow? Who Dahl was very tall. John Lithgow is very tall. They look not dissimilar, and Nick had a relationship with John Lithgow. They'd worked together before, and they were looking for a project, and Nick thought it would be a great match.
Wow, serendipity kicks in again. And tell me about the first conversations that you might have had with John as well in relation to him understanding what you hoped to get from the play and how he was going to be...
With John?
Yeah, and how he was now going to be your partner in relation to helping to bring this alive, along with the rest of the cast.
He's just the nicest man in the world.
Okay.
I mean, he really is. He's just so lovely. And but also, he's not, he doesn't just walk into any old thing.
I can imagine.
He read the play and said yes. And the first time I met him was at Nick Heitner's house in the summer, the following summer. He'd just arrived, he was quite jet lagged. And we read the play, I'd never heard it read out loud before, with other people.
Yeah.
We were sitting in Nick's front room. Nick was reading some of the parts, I was reading some of the parts. It's quite, if anyone's seen it, it's quite cross-talky, so it's quite hard to read. John was reading Dahl, but it was very jet-lagged, and by the about 40 pages in, he was starting to slope across the sofa, and the second half wasn't...
You didn't take that as feedback.
It was the first outing. No, it was great. It was the first time we ever heard it out loud, and then we did a workshop on it with a full company of actors in a room, just in a meeting room, and spent 3 days reading it and developing it. And he was just John is the son of a Shakespeare festival promoter.
Right.
And so he grew up as a child playing little small parts in Shakespeare's in the Midwest, I think.
Yeah.
On town halls and outdoor Shakespeare festivals, playing Peas Blossom, the Fairy, and Midsummer Night's Dream. It's just in his bones. He loves being amongst actors. Especially in theatre, and nothing seems to make him happier. It's being in a company. He's just very generous. So he always has behaved with that generosity.
I'm going to hand you over to the audience in a moment, because I think it's only fair that they also have an opportunity to ask you some questions. But just a few more. Let's all just remind ourselves that this is your first play. It's not a bad first attempt, is it, ladies and gents? So with all of that, I'm fascinated about leadership, and I'm fascinated about the human being as well as just the human doing. Why do people do what they do? And so many of my guests have achieved extraordinary things, but what is it that's driving them or taking them to that point? Is there a real standout lesson for you in this whole process? If I kind of take you back to the 2018, 2017, as you had this idea and here we are today with so many accolades, is there a real standout lesson for you?
Yeah, I mean, just having a go, doing it. I spent a lot of time worrying about doing all sorts of things, and it takes a certain kind of magical nudge.
Yeah.
But I do wish I'd, maybe allowed ideas I'd had in the past to breathe a bit more before I rejected them.
What was the magical nudge for you? Was that Nicholas?
Yeah, I mean that was the magical. That was the idea of me writing it hadn't occurred.
Okay. How can everyone see Giant?
By purchasing tickets. We do have one route in the room. It opens at the Harold Pinter Theatre on April the 26th, and it runs through until August the 2nd. So it's 14 weeks to see the magical John Lithgow as Roald Dahl.
Is that an initial 14 weeks? Could it?
No, it's a limited season. It's all we're doing.
Right.
Yeah.
And I saw something on the internet, as you do. Broadway?
That is a place, yes.
Chances of?
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously, it's something that's been that people have discussed around the show, and it would be great. It's not something that's confirmed at all at the moment, but could happen.
Here's my final question for you, and then I'm going to hand it over to you, ladies and gents. What's next for Mark?
Oh,
Is that you're going to be your question? Forgive me, I've stolen someone's thunder.
Thank you.
But what we were jesting over here as we were introducing you, and I was saying you need some more riders now. I don't know whether that's Evian and Petals or carriage bearers in some way. But what's next for you, Mark? I mean, you must be riding a wave, but
well, I'm late delivering a film that I'm writing. I've got a lot of work to do over the next couple of weeks. I just had to get an extension off the producers. So yeah, I'm adapting a book into a film, and I'm going to write another play and try to. And there's a couple of other things that I'm going to work on.
Mark, I just want to say a massive thank you for
thank you very much.
being part and parcel of the Leadership Enigma. Join us again next week for more curiosity and insight with the Leadership Enigma. We'd love to hear your comments on today's show, as well as suggestions for future topics and guests. Get in touch with me on LinkedIn or visit us at www.leadersenigma.com. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe on all your major podcast platforms and on our dedicated YouTube channel. Thanks again for joining the community.